Today's episode is brought to you by RDG Planning and Design. We're architects, landscape architects, engineers, artists, and planners with a passion for design and a drive to make a difference. We believe in applying new ways of thinking and innovative approaches to the preparation of plans that address community and regional issues. With offices in Omaha, Nebraska, St. Louis, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, and Des Moines, Iowa, we are a network of design and planning professionals dedicated to applying our talents in extraordinary ways. Hello and welcome to the Booked on Planning podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Rouse, transportation planner with the Lincoln-Lancaster County Planning Department, and I'm joined today by my co-host and fellow planner in the department, Andrew Theroff. We're here to get you hooked on planning through the books that have shaped the field. Let's dive in. Dylan is a senior planner in the New York City Department of City Planning, where he manages an initiative to help industrial businesses throughout the city become more resilient to the impacts of flooding and coastal storms. And Anna is the program manager at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence, administered by the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to write this book?
Sure. And first, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be on the podcast. The origins of this book are really intertwined with who I am and my career path. I'm originally from Asheville in Western North Carolina. And when I was beginning undergrad at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, on a whim, I signed up for a course in coastal planning with a professor named David Brower. And at that point, I don't think I had ever heard of city planning as a profession, but I signed up for this course. And within weeks of this class, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast, hit New Orleans and the areas surrounding. And I found myself completely absorbed in trying to understand what happened and what could have been different. And this really set me on a path studying city planning and in particular, trying to find ways to make communities more resilient and adaptive to their environments. Around the same time of this class, Dave Brower, the professor of that class, and Anna Schwab, who's also a planner and a researcher at University of North Carolina, were writing the first edition of this textbook on hazard mitigation and preparedness. And the two of them, Dave and Anna, became my main mentors as a student and in my career. And so when they were asked to update the book a few years later, I was really thrilled to join them as an author on that second edition. And then to keep things fresh and relevant, Anna and I just published a third edition of the book last year. So I should also mention that Dave Brower passed away in 2018. So he's not on the cover of this most recent edition, but is undoubtedly the inspiration for the book and a champion of really all of the concepts in it.
And he's definitely there in spirit. He was our mentor for many, many years, and he was in the forefront of the field of hazard mitigation before it was a thing on an official level, especially at the federal government level and whatnot. So a lot of what is in the book that Dylan's going to be talking about today is because of Dave Brower and his insights and his philosophy and just his approach to this field of natural hazards.
Well, let's start out with some kind of basic questions. The book is called Hazard Mitigation and Preparedness. Mitigation and preparedness are two different things. So can you explain the difference between the two approaches and why the difference is important from a regulatory and implementation standpoint?
Sure. So hazard mitigation and preparedness are both terms used to describe different phases of emergency management. They go along with response and recovery, which are the things that happen after a disaster. So essentially, mitigation refers to things you do to avoid risk or reduce damage and injury when there are events like natural hazards or technological hazards. So these include things like having a zoning code that limits new homes in the floodplain, or installing roofing that's less prone to igniting when wildfire embers hit it. Also, things like pruning trees around power lines to prevent outages during storms. So all of those kind of minimize risk or avoid damage or avoid disasters. Preparedness is more about actions that we take to be ready to respond when there is a disaster. So this includes things like evacuation planning or creating a plan to set up cooling centers when there's a heat wave. I often think it's helpful to think about this also at an individual level, because these are things we do in our everyday lives. If you imagine that you have a basement that occasionally has a little bit of flooding when it rains hard, and you see in the weather forecast that there's an inch or two of rain expected, you might go and carry some things upstairs from the basement. You might go ahead and borrow your neighbor's fan to help dry it out, assuming that it may flood. You may check that your sump pump is working. These all fall under the category of preparedness, and they're really important and really impactful. But if you start to notice that every time it rains, there's water pooling against the edge of your house, and that seems to be why you're having that kind of persistent flooding, you might install some different landscaping or change the downspouts of your gutter, or do something so that the water is moving out into the yard and being absorbed by the ground. And that would be an example of mitigation. It's doing things so that when it does rain, you're avoiding the flooding altogether. And I just say that one of the main challenges that we were trying to address in this book is that historically, emergency managers are really focused on preparedness and on responding to disasters. And they're really good at it. And that's a really valuable thing that they contribute to our communities. And we're trying to bring city planners and others into this hazard mitigation process, because many of the things that occur are kind of long-term planning, involve land use planning, and involve extensive community engagement. And these are things that are really in the wheelhouse of city planners. And so we think it's important that they're also thinking about how to manage disasters in this way.
You mentioned natural disasters, but also technological hazards. So when most of us think of hazard mitigation, we think of things like floods, hurricanes, wildfires, kind of that basic natural hazard types of things. But this book also talks a lot about human-made hazards like mass shootings, terrorism, chemical spills. In what ways can hazard mitigation planning help reduce the impact of these types of events?
It's a great question. So the book describes an approach for how to think about reducing risk. And that's really pretty similar from one type of hazard to another. In the FEMA and emergency management world, they often talk about this as an all hazards approach. So not distinguishing so much between natural hazards and those other kinds of human-made or technological hazards. So this process is basically first understanding what types of hazards a community faces. What could happen, what's happened in the past, how likely is it to happen, what would the consequences be if this happened, what property or people are particularly at risk. And at that point, after going through that process, you can come up with strategies to lower risk. So, for example, with a chemical spill, a town might do an assessment of businesses that store hazardous materials, understanding what those materials are so that the fire department and emergency managers kind of know how to deal with them if there is a spill. They might map out rail lines or highways where hazardous materials are transported through the town. And from there, they'd want to understand, well, who lives nearby? Are there any particularly vulnerable populations? Are there people who have limited mobility, people who don't speak English and might need additional communication to make sure that they're supported if there is an event? And at that point, the community can develop strategies to make people less vulnerable. And that could be identifying rail crossings that should have gates and warning lights, or that could be developing communication materials so that people know how to shelter in place if there's a spill at a nearby manufacturing plant or something. So all of these are things that kind of fit within that broader process of hazard mitigation. And, the book describes it both, as you said, for natural hazards and also for things like terrorist events and technological disasters as well.
Let's zoom out a little bit. As we mentioned at the beginning, I think the first edition of this book was published in 2007, 15 years ago. And now we're on the third edition now. Can you talk a little bit about how hazard mitigation has evolved over the past 10 to 15 years?
I think one very significant evolution is that we now have so much more data available to us to understand communities, to understand risk and prioritize decisions. I currently work in New York City in the Department of City Planning. And over the last few years, the Office of Emergency Management in New York City, as part of its hazard mitigation planning process, developed a tool to look at hazard consequences. And really what this does is it looks at every event over the last couple of decades. So every heavy rainfall, every nor'easter that hits the city, snowstorms, droughts, infrastructure failures, and so on. And then it brings in data from a ton of different sources, things like school closures and attendance, subway delays, how many tons of trash were collected by the Department of Sanitation on every given day, beach closures, and a kind of a range of other indicators. They can use this to say, okay, if we're predicted to have 6 inches of snow based on the last 20 years, what does that look like? What parts of the city are going to be affected? How can we prioritize our investments to make sure that we're using money wisely and supporting communities in the most targeted and effective way? This is one small example, but I think, we've also seen in the pandemic many examples of using sort of real-time data to understand what's going on, communicate that really quickly, and reduce risk. So I think that's one area that there's been really major transformation.
Yeah, technology and data availability has just improved dramatically in the last 15 years. One other thing I think about with the last 10 or 15 years is the political side of this. And I have a question for you about that, because obviously a lot of hazard mitigation planning is tied in with FEMA. So thinking back on 2007 and all the presidential administration changes we've had since then, the churn in Congress, is hazard mitigation impacted by political changes, or is it kind of insulated from that? Or maybe it just is bipartisan support?
I'd love Anna to take a first stab at that, who was involved in writing this from the beginning and has sort of a longer perspective on the field.
Yeah, but definitely the genre the milieu has evolved and changed over the years. A lot of that can be political. And the reason is anytime you have federal assistance involved, there has to be congressional action on that. It's not automatic that federal agencies get to hand over fistfuls of dollars. So all the rules and regulations probably become even more complicated over the years, I would say. But on the other hand, there's been growing awareness of the need of agencies like FEMA to be supported. So looking back in history, from the emergence of the nation and up through maybe the 30s, 40s, people were really on their own. You did not look to the government, and certainly you did not look to the federal government to help you out if your farm crop failed, if your community was flooded by a massive flooding of a river nearby. You just weren't expected to have to go to a government for help. You were self-sufficient, or your community worked together, or you suffered. Those were pretty much your choices. And so gradually, over time, the government stepped in because it became more apparent that helping communities, helping individuals when a disaster occurs is really helping the entire region or even the entire nation. So I would say there's been a lot more evolution in terms of federal assistance and what that looks like. It's also become much more sophisticated in terms of really pinpointing hazard mitigation as a way to reduce the payouts by the federal government when a disaster does occur.
In my previous job, we did a lot of hazard mitigation in rural communities who typically don't see any planning or have any planners involved. Right. And I think the idea that ultimately hazard mitigation is saving money in terms of payouts is a really popular one.
Yes. And there have been studies that actually show what the ratio is between every dollar spent in mitigation, how much money you're saving. One of the first ones of those was done by David Gottschalk years ago, and he came up with a ratio of $1 saves you $4. Now, in some instances, it's for every dollar spent in mitigation, you can have upwards of $12 of savings. So that's another evolution, is that if mitigation techniques become more sophisticated, the savings are greater, the risk is reduced.
Yeah, that's great. So one thing I really enjoyed about this book was all of the local case studies. For those of you who haven't read the book right now, they're basically integrated throughout the chapters as they're talking about the different topic. I really like the way that was done. Are there a couple of case studies you'd like to highlight and share with us?
Yeah. So as you said, we really did try to include examples from all over the country, and there are also a lot of things that are happening that are so encouraging and thoughtful. And so I feel like those case studies really did, they were so illustrative of the range of things that people can do and creative things that communities can do. So I'll give one example from close to home for me, which is in Charlotte, Mecklenburg, North Carolina. So they had really repeated flooding, particularly in the late 80s and 90s. That was really a concern for a lot of the community. And so at that time, the city and county created a stormwater fee to pay for local mitigation, both sort of reducing flood risk and also improving water quality. And within this, they ultimately created a program for voluntary buyouts of homes. So homes that are particularly at risk, that were flooding often multiple times and in the floodplain. And so this created a fund to buy these homes from people, allow them to move to a safer location, and then reuse that land for parks or other sort of lower intense, less intensive activities that are less risky when there is flooding. And this program, I think they've estimated that this has saved more than $25 million in avoided losses. And it's ultimately predicted to avoid more than 300 million in future losses. So similar to what Anna was saying, these kinds of programs over time with sustained commitment can really save communities a lot of money and save lives and really sort of make sure that communities are less disrupted when there is flooding. Another example that I'll give is from closer to your home, and I'm cheating because this wasn't in the book, but I was looking for FEMA best practices in Nebraska this morning. So in Dodge County, the Elkhorn River had repeated flooding for decades, causing a lot of crop damage and damage to different structures and homes. And so the county worked with the local community to apply for a FEMA hazard mitigation grant. And with that, they basically stabilized the riverbank, installing riprap, which is basically just kind of rocks and other materials to control erosion, and built stone jetties out into the river to slow the flow of the river during storms. And they also worked with the community to, basically had 100 landowners contribute money every year to a fund to maintaining this infrastructure. So the community really was bought into this, believed this was kind of a necessary and effective thing to be doing. So I think that's a really great example of something that's both sort of controlling flooding, and doing it, it also sort of creates habitat for wildlife and vegetation, and is sort of good for water quality by stabilizing those riverbanks. So those are a couple of really interesting examples. But as you said, there are many, many more.
I'd like to add to, and in particular, this pertains to the story about Charlotte Mecklenburg, is that at the time that they created this program, they were really forward thinking. It was very progressive because they incorporated projections of future development. And more development usually means more runoff, which means more flooding in a lot of instances. So that was really a new step in looking towards mitigation activities, is not just what are the conditions today, but what is coming down the pipe in terms of new growth that will either cause more impervious surfaces to be built and cause more runoff and flooding, but also a way to build those future development projects in places that aren't in hazard locations or in ways that will keep them safer.
Yeah, and that kind of ties into our discussion about technology and data and how that's all changing. And you kind of got to think as we go into the future, those projections are just going to get better and more accurate in terms of the impacts of what we're doing with our projects. Speaking of the future, let's talk about climate change. So climate change is discussed throughout the book. So can you share with us a little bit about how climate change impacts the types of hazards we might face and just what it means for the future of hazard mitigation as an industry?
Yeah, and I would say it's speaking of the future and also speaking of the present. But yeah, absolutely. Hazard mitigation and adapting to climate change go hand in hand. That was a big shift in the textbook, the second edition. We really tried to add a lot more information about climate change. And so we describe ways that climate is impacting the frequency of different kinds of hazards and the severity of different kinds of hazards. And this obviously varies a lot based on the kind of hazard we're talking about and the location. But the general takeaway is that we can no longer plan for the past. And so, for example, in coastal areas that are impacted by sea level rise, the 500-year floodplain today may be the 100-year floodplain a generation from now. In inland areas, if you build culverts under roads based on historical rainfall amounts, it may not be large enough for the rainstorms that we might expect in 10 or 20 years during the lifespan of that road. So this really involves kind of using projections and using all the data coming out of state and federal agencies about what we're expecting with climate change to modify the way we build our communities so that we're not kind of doing the same thing that we've always done. So in the book, we do give information about the latest climate science, but obviously that's changing a lot. So we also provide a lot of resources for more localized and up-to-date information. So this includes things like state climate offices or tools developed by the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, who are really leaders in a lot of coastal resiliency work. And I'll also add that one trend that is really hopeful here is that more and more people are accepting climate change as a reality. People are, still debating whether it's, caused by humans or natural trends. And I think that planners and emergency managers, they have the benefit of at least having most people believe that the world is changing and people are seeing more wildfires where they didn't exist before. They're seeing heavier storms that they haven't seen before. And so even for people who, are skeptical about some of the sort of politicized aspects of climate change, I think we're getting to a point that really many people understand that natural hazards are shifting. And if you are having a storm that reaches the 500-year floodplain, twice in a couple of years, perhaps that's no longer the 500-year floodplain. And I think that communities are starting to really act on that. And that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, we're seeing that a lot here in Lincoln, where our 100-year 1% floodplains are flooding way more frequently than that. So it's definitely something we're seeing in the Midwest too. Something else we've done is a climate action plan, which we adopted, I guess it was in 2020, which was essentially like a future thinking hazard mitigation plan where we're looking at future risks, future vulnerabilities, and then looking at ways to mitigate those hazards. Have you had much experience working with climate action plans, or do you have anything to say about those?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of direct experience. Last I saw, I think 30 something states have developed or adopted climate action plans. And I think that's, it's incredibly valuable to start to coordinate these kinds of activities across multiple agencies and multiple actors. So I don't know if Anna, if you have anything to add on that.
No, it's just that I think California was really a forerunner on that and kicked off the ball, so to speak, to have an actual plan that did concentrate on climate and what communities can do about that to reduce the impacts. But like Dylan said, lots of places are jumping on that bandwagon now because they see the need for it as well as the utility of planning for that specific type of event.
So the other big topic, I guess, at the moment is COVID-19. Your recent edition of the book added some items about COVID, but obviously it's like a month by month changing situation. Has there been anything new regarding pandemics with regulatory guidance or best practices that other communities have done?
Yeah, so the book, as you said, does include some information about infectious disease and biological hazards, including COVID. Although I would say that as we were writing this new edition, it was really at the start of the pandemic, and we didn't want to get too over our skis on that issue. I would say in terms of best practices, I think that COVID-19 has been a really good example of how important it is to find effective ways to communicate across organizations and especially with the public. So we've seen that people look to trusted sources of information to understand the world around them and to make decisions. And emergency managers and planners really need to tap into those diverse networks to communicate information. So we've seen this with things like around masking and social distancing and vaccine uptake. So putting information on a government website is no longer enough, and local government, or maybe was never enough. And local governments and emergency managers have to continually build those relationships and build trust. And that includes with major employers and houses of worship and nonprofits and other groups and institutions in a community. So I think that's one thing that is not really a revelation or something that's particular to COVID, but I think has really been highlighted by what we've all kind of observed over the last couple of years.
And the role that public health plays. That was not traditionally something that emergency managers in particular would necessarily think of in their day-to-day work. But now the role of public health and epidemiologists has come more to the forefront and awareness by the general population.
Let's talk about the future a little bit. So do you foresee any future trends in the hazard mitigation industry, either on the regulatory side at the national or state level, or even just implementation at the local level?
I think one interesting thing to keep an eye on is the role of private insurance and reinsurance industries. We've seen recently the insurance industry has been pulling out of certain risky locations. This happened in coastal areas decades ago related to flood insurance, but there are now examples of companies that are no longer insuring homes for fire in some areas in California, for example. And while that's really significant for those homeowners, there's also sort of an alternative world here where these companies begin to become strong advocates and allies in mitigating hazards as a way of sort of reducing their potential for large payouts after catastrophic disasters. So I think there is a potential for the insurance industry, which is one of the biggest sectors in the world, to play more of a role in promoting actions at the local level and at state level to reduce risk to different kinds of hazards. I think one other positive trend is that there appears to be a growing awareness surrounding issues of equity as it relates to natural hazards and disasters. So more communities that have marginalized communities, whether they're communities of color or low-income communities, the elderly, immigrants, other kinds of vulnerable groups, are providing more targeted technical assistance to become more resilient and really support and lift up those parts of their community. There's still a very long way to go with all of this, but I think it's encouraging to see that the topic of equitable distribution of government resources and government assistance is something that's being considered by a lot of agencies. As one small example, one of FEMA's main mitigation grant programs, the BRIC program, it's now required to prioritize at least 40% of the funding for disadvantaged communities. So agencies are starting to really set guidelines and allocate funding to make sure that they're addressing equity in the way that they're mitigating hazards and preparing for hazards. So this is all, I think, a really positive and important trend.
So switching gears a little bit, if someone's interested in getting into hazard mitigation, first of all, what would be some potential career options for someone who thinks the topic's interesting, and then how would they get into those industries?
Well, unfortunately, I'd say this isn't a field that's going away, and it's probably expanding. But that is good news for people interested in this kind of work. There are a lot of opportunities in the public sector. So hazard mitigation planning is often led by local emergency management agencies. In some cases, local planning agencies take the lead with this, but most municipalities in the country are engaged in some form of hazard mitigation planning. Sometimes this is happening at the county level, or sometimes it's happening at the regional level, but it's occurring all over the country, and there are incentives and government resources to make sure that local communities have the ability to do hazard mitigation planning. Similarly, states develop their own hazard mitigation plans. They review local plans. They manage grants to actually implement projects. So again, state typically within the emergency management agency of the state, there's typically a group of people who are really focused on this work and helping communities reduce risk to a range of hazards. And then within all of these, both at sort of the local and state level, there are private sector consulting firms that really support a lot of this work. So these are often sort of engineering and design firms that have expertise in managing disasters, managing in doing this kind of emergency planning, and also with climate resilience. So like those kinds of climate action plans, there's really a lot of private sector organizations that are involved in supporting cities and states in doing that. And then finally, I'd add there are federal jobs that are focused on this as well. So FEMA is the main one that comes to mind, but there's hazard mitigation occurring through the Army Corps of Engineers. There's this kind of coastal resiliency work going on within the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. So a range of federal agencies are also doing this kind of work or supporting communities in doing this kind of work.
And what type of academic background does someone usually have working in these fields? I guess there's so many jobs we just talked about, so maybe you can't really narrow it down. Maybe I should reframe that as, are there any university programs that have planning that focus on hazard mitigation?
I'll let Anna take that one since she works at one.
I do. The university where I am at UNC Chapel Hill, it's not a program per se that deals with emergency management or planning for hazards, but those topics are incorporated into a lot of courses throughout the disciplines, different departments, geography, sociology, public health, all can have that aspect incorporated into them. The environmental programs, environmental studies, environmental engineering often have a strong natural hazards component and resilience building component to them.
Well, this has been a really good conversation. To wrap up, I want to ask what you think is the most important takeaway for listeners of this episode or readers of the book.
Well, thank you again. We've really enjoyed having the chance to talk with you today. I think the main thing is just that there's a lot that we can do to make communities safer and allow them to bounce back after disasters. And, given that we're talking predominantly to a crowd of city planners, I'd emphasize that historically, a lot of this work has taken place within the emergency management community. And partly that's a reflection of the way that funding has come down from the federal government through FEMA and to state and local emergency management agencies. But there are many solutions, particularly those related to mitigating hazards, that involve land use planning, that involve sustained engagement with communities, that require a very holistic view of the way communities function and grow. And these are all things that are very much in the wheelhouse of city planners. And so I just encourage planners to learn about what's going on in their community, what are they doing to mitigate hazards, to prepare for hazards, and try to be an active partner in that process.
Again, thank you, Dylan and Anna, for joining us today and talking about hazard mitigation and preparedness.
Thank you so much.